This lecture continues the series on Byzantine art, looking at the tradition following iconoclasm until its repeal, all the way to the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. We will begin the lecture looking at the period between iconoclasm and restoration, or between the prohibition against images to when that is repealed and they are put back in churches and icon production renews. The periods of Byzantine art are known as the Golden Ages once again, not only, of course, for their use of gold, but also for the rich variety and level of production that we see in these periods. The earliest period is going to be from 527 until 726. This period we looked at last time with the rise of Justinian, the building of the Hagia Sophia, and many of the early great monuments as Byzantium will expand out to the west again, retaking the Italian peninsula. Following this, we'll talk about now, the middle period is going to be from the repeal of prohibition of images or iconoclasm in 843 up until the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Christians from the west sack Constantinople and they lose control of it. Now, the late period picks back up whenever they reconquer and reconstitute an area of the Byzantine Empire, the Greek area, until the end where the Ottoman Turks conquer them in 1453. Leading up until the ban of images, we find Justinian II in the 6th century is going to greatly expand both the production and the veneration of icons, or images of holy figures painted on panel. So these icons, along with relics, or objects associated with holy persons, which could be their body or something they touched, were considered trustworthy representations of the divine, and give us a direct conduit to the divine. Now, in the article, Viken is going to state that the direct confrontation with divinity is provided here through this window, and thus we see that this understanding of holiness develops from relics with images, or relics associated with these images of holy persons, to only venerating the icon, or the image of the holy person. Therefore, we start by understanding the physical remains of holy people to be important in getting our message to God or to this holy individual, but then we can skip that and go directly to them via an image as seen here. Now, there are many prescribed rituals associated with the veneration of icons still in use today in the Orthodox community. One of those is known as proskynesis, or kissing towards, literally, as it is known, where you would prostrate yourself before an image and often kiss the base of it. You would also place candles at the base of the icon and light them. As in many Catholic churches today, these votive candles are also lit and placed before images of the Virgin Mary or other saints. Now, the goal of an icon painter, very importantly for this class, is not to come up with something original or lifelike, to make it look like someone who exists or lived today, but instead to duplicate the prototype of what the original icon they're copying looks like, so as not to dilute the power held within that icon. Therefore, what we find resulting are copies of copies. The more closely they conform to that original image, the more power they retain within it. Now, we know that icons are believed to hold miraculous powers and qualities because they are perceived to be a direct link to the divine, the images they represent. They could also serve as a palladium or a mantle. Now, this is an image that could provide security not just to the individual praying towards it, but to the whole community involved. This is going to be seen in the West in images of the Madonna della Misericordia, or the Madonna of Mercy, who is going to be extending out her cloak, protecting an entire village. Now, this is going to, at this point, erase the distinction between the likeness of what the image represents and an idol or something you're worshiping. So that was seen as dangerous. This is the progression towards banning images because people are worshiping them as though they are the actual religious figures they represent. Therefore, there are two major perspectives here that we need to take into account. One is an argument against images or icons, and the other one is for them. When it comes to the argument against icons, these are known as iconoclasts, those that want to break images, we find several points are made. One, they believe that the veneration of said icons violated the spirituality of worship, which they believed the divine presence is only found in Christ through the liturgy or through the Eucharist. That's the only time God is present here on earth. Secondly, we must look at the Ten Commandments in Exodus 24, in which we have a prohibition against graven images, so we should not worship idols. We're very familiar with this prohibition. Also, they state that icons are produced by human hands, thus they are not defined by contact with the divine like relics are. So a holy person did not touch this. Therefore, how can it be a conduit to the divine or represent something divine? On the other hand, the argument for images or icons is made by iconodules or iconophiles, those that love images. And their arguments are as follows. One, they state that images are going to fulfill a didactic role in that they are visual aids for the illiterate, recounting and repeating this understanding that the Bible is going to be for the literate, whereas images are the Bible for the illiterate. Secondly, these icons serve as a prototype and provide a channel for the faithful directly to who they're trying to reach, focusing once again their mind and their souls on them. Third, Genesis 1:27 states that man was created in God's image. Therefore, the image of man must reflect the deity himself, as God is incarnated as Christ. So this is going to underscore that notion that we see the divine in us. While these arguments are set forth, something else is happening in the Byzantine Empire, the rise of Islam. For under Leo III, who grew up near the Arab frontier, we find that he has exposure to the Islamic prohibitions, or aniconism, that being the ban of all religious imagery, and believed that God was punishing the Christian Roman Empire for idolatry. His son, Constantine V, would then destroy all of these icons, being raised by his father in this belief that they were once again the result of or causing the loss of territory to this new religion. So he had mosaics torn down from churches and destroyed icons. So 2/3 of Byzantine territory at this point had been lost to Arab Muslims. And so this was seen to be the cause. They did not worship idols, so therefore God was punishing the Christians who did. And so they must rectify the situation. So we find that the apse mosaic that we left off with last time, here the Transfiguration in Santa Plenaria and Claus or Ravenna, is going to begin with these New Testament figures shown only symbolically, the cross being the only thing appropriate for iconoclasts. So iconoclasm, with the official imperial image ban by Leo III in 726, is going to not immediately be enforced, but we find that the Iconoclastic Council of 754 finally bans all religious imagery in churches under Constantine V that we just mentioned. So as always, these prescriptions that are handed down by the church take a while to be implemented. Traditions need to change. So this is going to very importantly also assert the authority of the state over the church, also known as Caesaropapism, as we discussed with Justinian as he established it. So Caesaropapism is going to challenge the wealth and popularity of monasteries, who drew thousands of people to venerate their icons and to see them and ask for assistance. So the church basically was getting too powerful and wealthy and threatened the emperors. So the emperors struck back by outlawing these images that drew the faithful and were the cause of the money that the monasteries were receiving. Instead, they replaced these very beloved images of Christ and his mother with familiar symbols, and the only one approved by said iconoclasts like Constantine V was the cross. Now, Empress Irene, an ecumenical council of 787, did restore the veneration of icons, but it was short-lived. Leo V in 818 reinstated iconoclasm, and John the Grammarian is going to lead the official second wave of iconoclasm, destroying what had just been produced. The Middle Byzantine period does not begin until we have the renunciation of iconoclasm, that being a removal of the ban, and lasts until the Crusaders' occupation of Constantinople in 1204. It was at this time that we have Macedonian emperors, that area north of Greece proper, that will find a renaissance in Byzantine art, looking back to the classical past and reinstating many of these classical motifs in more naturalistic scenes. Basil I the Macedonian would be the restorer of the Roman Empire, and the great renovation, that being refurbishing the decorations that had been defaced or neglected under the iconoclasts. We have an example of that in Hagia Sophia, where the Virgin Theotokos in Christ will be enthroned in an apse mosaic. Apses, of course, representing heaven. The gold surrounding the Mother of God on this throne and her Son, representing the heavenly aura that would reflect the light coming in from the various windows. She wears red shoes, again reserved for Roman emperors in the East. Looking back to 5th century mosaics in Rome and elsewhere, we find a new eclecticism is going to combine the Greek and the Roman, that being the stylized Greek approach with the naturalistic Roman approach, in this new flattened, stylized classical revival. The inscription below this reads, "The pious emperors," that is Basil I, "replaced ones that the impostors or the iconoclasts had destroyed." Hence, defacing the image and the visage of Christ was seen as an attack on Christianity itself. Here we have a new eclecticism from the Greco-Roman naturalism that will be combined with that Byzantine penchant for flatness and stylization. Compared to the earlier Theotokos, we can see that the throne is at an angle to the so-called picture plane, and can be read as hovering in space. While at the same time, the drapery is even more schematic, not showing tonal variations from the highlights to the shadows as had earlier been blended haptically. Now we find there is an optic approach to the drapery. At the same time as this revival with mosaics, we see also a revival with icons, for the end of iconoclasm was officially announced with the public installation of the icon of Christ on the chalk gate of the Imperial Palace in 843. Here we find a Hodegetria pose, or the Madonna as an icon pointing to Christ, was believed to have been painted by St. Luke. Now the Virgin here is pointing or guiding the way to Christ, hence Hodegetria, the way shower, is showing the way to salvation, surrounded by these contemporary figures, ecclesiastical and imperial. Here we have St. Luke painting the said portrait of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. So this one, of course, is made by a holy figure, therefore it was touched by them, and it can be considered a relic as well as an icon. Here we can see the icon presented and held up by these angels dressed as priests, surrounded by other priests and the emperor off to the left. St. Theodosia is also present. She had been killed trying to protect a holy image on the chalk gate previously from iconoclasts. Now she is, of course, going to be venerated as a saint, seen here in the lower left, holding an image that she attempted to protect and died for. The understanding of these iconophiles, or those that reinstate the worship of icons and other images of holy figures, is quite clear. In manuscript illuminations, the impious folly of iconoclasm is set forth. Now here, choosing from a verse in Psalm 51, we find that they are going to be rebuking earthly treasures over heavenly ones. This is seen in several episodes. In the upper section, St. Peter is trampling the sorcerer Simon Magus, coming from Acts 8, where he spills a bucket of coins. Hence, he is greedy and avaricious and values earthly rewards over heavenly ones. Down below, the same thing can be seen seen as the iconophile or lover of images. Nikephoros is going to hold an icon of Christ in his left hand, while he tramples the iconoclast John the Grammarian below his feet, who also is surrounded by coins. Hence, these greedy individuals are seen to be the ones responsible for iconoclasm, instead of the true worship of the image of God. Now here we find that they relied on wealth and power rather than God, just as Judas had betrayed Christ. So too had John the Grammarian betrayed Christ. Now, iconoclasm was also directly linked in visceral terms to tormenting Christ himself. So here we have Mark 15 and Luke 24, the episode of Christ's crucifixion where Christ is given vinegar. In the episode, we find Christ is shown at the crucifixion, whereby a vinegar sponge is placed on his face. Now down below, we find that John the Grammarian and the bishop deface the image of Christ by cleaning it with vinegar. Therefore, they're seen as analogous. Crucifying Christ and harming him is the same as destroying his image and removing it, as the iconoclasts had done. They harmed this holy image. It should also be noted that it was at this time the final schism between Rome and Constantinople occurred in 1054, whereby the Pope in Rome and the Byzantine Patriarch excommunicated one another. Therefore, here we have the final split between the Eastern and Western churches, today known as Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Now, emperors and patriarchs would use commissions to reinforce their relationship of Christ with the crown. Remember that in Constantinople and Byzantium, Christianity was overseen by the emperor, who was also the pope, just like the ancient Roman Empire. Therefore, Christ and imperial authority are seen as one. And this goes back to Justinian, seen here as a conqueror with Christ approving above. So restoring these mosaics and adding many more, we find that in Hagia Sophia, these emperors tried to tie their relationship with God more closely together. We find there is a pantocrator added in the dome, now replaced by Kufic script, and winged seraphim in the pendentives. So these seraphim are going to be bodiless angels with a head surrounded by wings. As it should be remembered, there are 9 levels or hierarchies of angels and the different classifications. The closer one gets to God, the less corporal you are. And thus, of course, you take on a more spiritual form. And that's what the seraphim do, is merely sing in a circle around God. The 9 levels are, of course, as follows. We generally see those represented in art as angels and archangels. So angels most commonly delivering messages and or as divine presences in art, and archangels such as Michael and Gabriel, who are the divine hand of God carrying out his will, such as telling Mary that she will give birth to the Son of God, or the archangel Michael casting Satan out of heaven. If we go all the way up to the supreme hierarchy, this is where we have cherubim and seraphim. These two we also see quite commonly in art. In the Renaissance, the cherubim are going to become those baby-like angels that have wings, much like Cupid, whereas seraphim are going to be the bodiless angels that have heads and wings. Now, while also decorating the dome and the pendentives with the new pantocrator and the seraphim, we have several new ex votos, or from the vow made. That being an ex voto is an image painted of a holy figure in thanks for a favor they did for you. So these can be found especially in the narthex. Now here we have several royal families in a row will commission these images, recognizing the vow the imperial family made in recognition to divine favors over these doors. Now, doors, as we will see here in a moment, are going to be one of the most commonly decorated forms in architecture and in sculpture, and they're called a church portal. This is going to be a theological message that is spread to a wide public audience, much like a billboard today on the side of the road. People came to church and everyone walked through these doors. Therefore, on it, we have a tympanum being the largest area above the door. That is the semicircular lunette above the doorway. Because it is the largest flat area, this is where we find mosaics are going to be carried out. Here we have the mosaic of the Virgin and Child enthroned in the center between Emperors Constantine I and Justinian I. This one produced in the South Vestibule in Hagia Sophia in the late 10th century. Here we find that the Virgin is a protector of the church and the city, and this is an ex voto, it must be remembered. So we have a divine figure and the people she helped. So here we have Constantine and Justinian. Both of them, of course, are long dead by several centuries at this point, but they represent the founding imperial family that is, of course, going to trace their lineage back. So here we have a divine figure in the center, flanked by two earthly figures on the side, granting them authority and giving them favor. Very common and well established in Byzantine art at this time. Off to the side, we have Justinian I in a donor-type portrait, who offers Hagia Sophia, the very church we are walking into, in honor of the Virgin Mary. This is going to honor the meritorious donations of the two principal emperors in the history of the site of Hagia Sophia. On the other side, we see Constantine I, who is now canonized and is, of course, a saint, who offers the city of Constantinople, named after him eponymously, to the Virgin Mary. And so she protects the city and its principal church, the cathedral. In the center, we can see the Virgin Mary is going to be in the same pose with her hand draped over the right shoulder of Christ, who holds a scroll, as in the interior of the decorations a century earlier. Here we have the standard classicizing style retained, with a brighter tonality, with closed silhouettes, their bodies flattened, emphasizing instead the imperial regalia. This renewed interest in classicism would spread throughout the Mediterranean, as will all Byzantine influence. And this includes, of course, Muslim and Christian areas. And this was connected to the reopening of the Academy in Constantinople that studied classical texts. It had been closed during Iconoclasm, but it began educating again youth in the classics, Greek classics specifically, philosophy, drama, and poetry. And this in turn affected developments in book illustration. Now, the Constantinopolitan Academy, reopened by the Macedonian dynasty, would be responsible for the Macedonian Renaissance, or a continuity of Hellenic heritage, and paralleled the later Carolingian Renaissance that also sought to revive the classical past. Between 800 and 1000, we see in Byzantium classicism returning. So through the 9th and 11th centuries, narrative illustrations in books revived classicizing tendencies. And these were found only in book illustration because texts were copied from ancient Greek sources. Now, these were copied in scriptoria, or writing studios of monasteries, where we would find these ancient texts would be copied exactly along with their illustrations. So therefore, they're copying one medium to the same medium. Therefore, we see more classicism in book illumination than in mosaics. Here, as an example, with the homilies of Gregory Nazianzus, we have Ezekiel in the Valley of the Dry Bones of 880. Here, the classical revival, or Renaissance, a rebirth of the classical tradition, carried over in biblical illustrations. In this episode of Ezekiel 31, an angel leads the prophet through the valley with bones and skulls that can be seen in the upper section. The prophet receives the command from God to prophesy the resurrection. So here's an example of typology or parallelism, whereby we're foretelling something that will happen in the New Testament. But what is interesting is how it is carried out. We have a very impressionistic and fluid set of brushstrokes using atmospheric perspective, subtle tonal gradations that use the late antique technique, and thus it is classical in style, if not in subject matter. This is a biblical Christian subject, but it is a pagan style. This, of course, taken from Homer's rosy-fingered dawn that we discussed from Virgil's Georgics. So here we find the green-brown ground will fade into a blue sky above, along a fuzzy horizon of pink. Thus, the same technique is used now for biblical illustration during this revival of classical Greek texts. Here, turning to the Psalter, we have David composing Psalms of 950. This is both classical, interestingly enough, in style and content. So not only is it copying the style of antiquity, the content is not biblical. It actually uses pagan references. Here we have a design of a mural painting instead of a miniature, as we saw a moment ago, much like the mural paintings that will be unearthed in Pompeii and Herculaneum centuries later. So here we find that several figures are in a circular composition surrounding here this figure of David, who are composing these psalms. Now, the shepherd figure is not meant to represent Christ, but the Hellenistic example of Orpheus playing to animals, as you see all these animals surrounding David. Thus, this functions as an author portrait, as David is going to be the author of the Psalms. And so in books, before the text is written or follows, we have an image of who wrote it, and that is an author portrait. So here we have Melodia, the musical inspiration who sits behind David, coming directly from antiquity. Echo is behind the column in the top right, who is of course cursed by Hera to only echo what other people say because she is going to be very annoying and wouldn't stop talking. Then you have Bethlehem down below, who's labeled as a river god and personifies where David spent his youth. All of these are taken directly from classical sources. The illusionistic effects, as well as with Ezekiel, have fluid brushwork and idealized types in a centripetal design. Thus it is circular, all surrounding David with these animals, a river god, and these two classical figures. Here we find the same type of centripetal composition also in the Ezekiel figures and composition, and the illusionistic brushwork and coloring are also the same. The iconic features here are entirely abandoned, as seen earlier in the Rabula Gospels. Instead, we have symmetry, hieratic scale, and frontality are going to be more common earlier on. Now we see this classical revival that values placing people carefully in space, having careful tonal modulation, and realism. Another more literal antique revival can be seen here in the use of scrolls instead of a codex. So scrolls had been ceased to be used ever since the 5th century. In this particular roll, called the Joshua roll, we have his military campaigns on a continuous frieze in a scroll format. Now this is designed after sculpted triumphal columns in Rome. Here, if we compare it to that of, say, Trajan's column, we can see Joshua and the emissaries from Gibeon. And once again, we see the same types of scenes and episodes in these Roman precedents. This is an abridged text, thus we don't have every episode carried out here, and it could not be used as a manual for church use. Instead, it's for contemporary military heroes in the Byzantine armies, the new Joshua. Here we find faint tints of red, yellow, blue, and brown wash are going to be seen over gold and thick tempera that cracked when it was rolled up. This is going to link 3 scenes together with a faint landscape in the background. Thus it is not physically separate, an interesting classical motif for a continuous narrative. Now here at the very left we find the messengers are going to ask for Joshua's help. At the right, the emissaries report that the Amorites had besieged Gibeon. Joshua's armies then are going to attack in the next section of the scroll. Thus, from Joshua 9, it states he slew them, the Amorites. But in between them, where the city is located, we have a very interesting figure that comes directly from antiquity, not from Christianity. This is Tyche, or luck, the Roman equivalent to Fortuna, or fortune, who is the presiding tutelary deity that governed fortune and prosperity and the destiny of a city. She is the daughter of Aphrodite and Zeus, or in another tradition, Aphrodite and Hermes. So here we see that personifications become quite common from this point onward. Places and cities are going to be shown as women with crowns. Generally in Tyche, we see the personification of the city with a crown forming the city gate on the crest of it here. Other examples of this classicizing motif can also be seen in biblical illustration. Here, an author portrait. This one of St. Mark from the 10th century that also has classical motifs in this evangelist portrait. The Constantinopolitan workshop that created it was also working off of classical manuscripts. Here, with this author portrait, we have motifs from ancient portraits of philosophers. We know this because the costume and the architecture is actually going to represent a Hellenistic library. The type does not exist currently in Constantinople, and instead is a past representation of architecture from classical antiquity. Here we find the tradition that we have here in the West is to place the evangelist in a landscape with a symbol, as we will talk about here shortly with the Igbo Gospels. In the East, we find that they're going to be shown within an architectural structure and a backdrop to show where and when they were located. Now turning to what happens next around the year 1000, here we have the Archangel Michael from the Melanolian of Basil II, this one in the Vatican Library. And now we begin to retreat from illusionism. This is going to cease in the imperial court, and a new iconic style that is more hieratic with its features, with an abstract gold background, will take over and be dominant. As in this example, we have a tall frontal figure with demons placed symmetrically below. Two blue demons directly at Archangel Michael's feet and two black demons off near the mountains. The costume is drawn in hard straight lines, and the setting is very simplified compared to the earlier example of the Joshua role. And there is little atmospheric illusionism, hence things do not fade at a distance and become less defined. Thus, this will foretell the crisis that will happen after 1204. The same can be said in imperial portraits, such as the one seen here of the Virgin and Child between Emperor John Comnenus and Empress Irene in the South Gallery of Hagia Sophia from the 12th century. In it again we have the Virgin Mary and Christ in the center, flanked by two imperial figures off to either side. This is found in the imperial box, which was reserved only for the imperial family, and it is an example of another ex voto. It is created with very fine tesserae, creating weightless bodies that become lost behind the regalia instead of heavy, weighty forms. Thus, it revives an earlier tradition of Byzantine art that we discussed in Ravenna with Emperor Justinian, communicating permanence and, once again, the eternal presence of God and divinity, thus, of course, the eternal strength and power of those represented with them. So the holy figure here is elevated slightly above the other two and flanked by the two figures offering donations. In this instance, we find that the emperor is going to hold a bag of silver, while the empress a roll of parchment. And this is going to reflect what is actually happening in the church, as it is very common for the rituals at the imperial court, which also included the Eucharist. Now we can see that we retain many elements of the Hodegetria and Theotokos conventions, including a long oval face, large almond-shaped eyes, and a small pinched mouth, along with a long arched nose and dark shading along the contours of the cheeks and the eyes. However, we no longer have the interest in illusionism with the angling of the knees out towards the viewer or a throne. Everything is flattened, and we are now emphasizing this iconic approach instead of a classical one. The same can be seen in the Harborville triptych here from the mid-11th century, whereby the same composition and interest in flattened forms and subtle variation will abound. Here we find above Christ that's flanked by St. John the Baptist and the Virgin Mary with angels in these tondi or roundels above. Below we have, of course, the apostles and other holy figures holding their works that they have written, along with the inscriptions identifying them along their heads. Here we have a holy figure flanked by two other figures, standard for this type of decoration, now in the Middle Byzantine period. We elevate these holy figures that are going to be flanked. The figure of Christ, flanked by the Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist, is known as the Deus's group and will become very important as it anticipates scenes of last judgments, whereby you have the same figures present. Here we also have angels offset in the tondi or tandos. So here we find that this is influenced by icon painting such as St. Peter here from the early 7th century. Now, this is going to showcase the flattened hieratic approach that becomes more common as we approach the late period. So here with the Ascension, we have another example of this move towards something that is more iconic, foretelling this catastrophe that will befall Byzantium. Here we have these original compositions that are meant to illustrate mythical content of monk sermons with bright, almost garish colors that frame the standard scene below. Unlike the Rabula Gospels, we have a further move away from realism as we have a total gold background without even a ground that the figures stand on as they watch the ascension of Christ. This one, of course, extra biblical because the figures were not present, but this is, of course, well established in Byzantine iconographic traditions. Here, we're going to see the interest in flattened figures of a gold background, of removing them from an actual time and place, and flattening them out to where we focus on their regalia and what they represent instead of what they looked like. So we see this crisis coming in 1204. Now we will turn to the crisis as we transition from Constantinople to Istanbul, or the reclaiming of Constantinople until it is taken away again by the Ottoman Turks. The period leading up until the Fourth Crusade is known as the Middle Byzantine period, or the Golden Age, and is going to have a new type of church design and decoration associated with it. Here we find that the middle period, as we just discussed, is going to last from Iconoclasm to the occupation of Constantinople. In it, we find that monasticism is going to balance the power of church and state, following the rule of St. Basil, who is going to live until 379. Now, this is organized around the individual and small communities of monks. Therefore, we have small churches associated with these communities, but they are highly influential. In architecture, several new churches are built to expand the Byzantine religion and empire in the middle period. Here, the monastery churches at Hosios Lukas are going to have structures that serve the monks in this monastery as well as the parish or the town surrounding them. The type of churches seen in the middle period are known as cross-in-square churches, for they are going to have a Greek cross inside a square plan. Now, in the middle period, we find that we no longer have plain brick facades or exteriors that were common in Christian decoration and architecture going back to Constantine, modeled on Roman basilicas. Now we find that they are going to be decorated like Islamic architecture, showing that they are influenced by this Eastern culture. The technique seen here in Hosios Lukas is going to be cloisonné, which is a term to describe light stones framing dark red bricks, giving us a much more engaged and dramatic facade, more in line with what was appreciated in the Near East. The plan itself contains several churches. Not only do we have the Church of the Mother of God, or the Theotokos, we have the Church of Hosios Lukas, and or the Church of St. Luke and Styrus. This is going to be the Middle Byzantine example that we will use to illustrate where architecture evolves and how it evolves. In the plan here of the Catholicon of Hosios Lukas, the central church, we have the Greek cross plan. Hence, we have equidistant arms of the nave and the transept. In this instance, and very commonly in the Middle Byzantine period, resting on squinches. Now, squinches are going to be a cube-like design that spreads the weight or distributes it more broadly along a cube on which a dome rests. Hence it has thicker piers than pendentives and less windows. There is not as much space in between the arches. Therefore not as much light can enter and penetrate the interior Middle Byzantine space. Here we still have the same terminology and vocabulary used for Christian churches, with the nave in the center, aisles off to the side, a transept crossing the nave, and then the apse where the high altar is. We even still retain the narthex or entryway to get into the aisles and nave proper. What changes, however, is the way in which we move our eye ascending upwards, as we have a cross and square plan, or circle once again inscribed within this cross. So we have repeated squares that move us up and up and up, until we eventually reach the circle of heaven. Circles are infinite. There is no beginning nor end. Therefore, they're going to represent heaven in its golden magnificence, with archangels surrounding Christ, who's holding a book, now bearded with his blessing of benediction. The interlocking spatial units here show squares within squares. Thus they get smaller, pulling us upward from scenes representing the life of Christ and the apostles below, up to him ascending into heaven and eternity. The symbolism here, as we discussed last time, is the same as baptistries, as we are combining a circle of the dome and a square at the base. Thus we have the earthly realm where we live, and thus the episodes that will be shown are happening on earth, and that will transition into a circle which represents heaven or eternity above. Thus it is an image of the cosmos. This can be seen most clearly in the most famous Middle Byzantine church, the Church of the Dormition on Daphne, Greece. It's going to be built and decorated between 1080 and 1100. Now it's called the Church of the Dormition because that is Latin for sleep. It really represents the death and ascension of the Virgin Mary. It is also a cross and square plan, just as Hosios Lukas was. And it's also going to be the most famous because the mosaics actually survive within. Now there are fewer units of space, so the mosaics are more integral to the decoration here, and how they are laid out is important. Autodemus, for instance, one of the most famous medieval scholars, is going to note that there is a tripartite division of the church, which is meant to equal the cosmos. So we find that in the great chain of being, in this Neoplatonic hieratic organization, we have God, and that is arranged further down through angels, man, and earth. So we find that the dome represents heaven, where the Pantocratorism God is located. The squinches and the vaults represent paradise of the Holy Lands, where the lower piers and walls where we are represent the terrestrial world. Thus the mosaics reflect this division. The closer we get to heaven, the more holy and iconic the figures become. The further away from heaven, the more they are narrative and grounded on what happens here on earth. Culminating in a series of mosaics in the dome itself, we now have Christ as Pantocrator, and or as the last judge, the ruler of all, now shown bearded with deeply incised lines around his face and a frown carving his lips. He holds a bejeweled Bible here that would have been held by the priest below, and his hand no longer raises the two fingers, the middle and index finger, to bless us. It now is curled over. We retain in this instance the cruciform halo or equidistant halo that is going to show us that he is Christ, but now he is bearded and of course looks very suspiciously off to the left, his left we should state, which is where the damned are located. The damned of course are going to be the focus of his rage. But of course we must ask, why is he bearded? In the Western tradition, Christ's bearded appearance is going to be known from Veronica's veil, a relic that's going to be kept in the Vatican, where a woman named Veronica, according to this tradition, is going to offer a cloth to wipe Christ's face on the road to Calvary, and On the cloth appeared a miraculous image of Christ with a beard. Hence, from the early 8th century onward, Christ will be shown with a beard in the West, but especially in the Middle Byzantine period. For we find the Arabs are going to be gobbling up and eating Christian territory. And so we find Christ is going to be shown much more menacingly, threateningly judging. In the squinches, we also have the Annunciation, Nativity, Baptism of Christ, and Transfiguration. They are not actually shown as narratives or stories, but instead are staged as performances. Here we can see the mosaic in the squinch with the Annunciation, as Gabriel is going to gesture across this squinch or this concave space to the Virgin Mary, who looks shyly away to the right. This is taken from Luke 1:26, and thus we see the same episodes carried out here, but we lack an interior space or location where this is occurring. They actually project, it is argued, from the background into the naos where we are in the nave. They face each other by way of the curvature of the squinch, so they're on opposite sides, so physically they flank one another. The same can be said of the Transfiguration, where Christ will elevate and will, of course, emanate this white glow as his clothing also turns white, as we have two Old Testament figures that will be seen miraculously floating alongside them. They as well are going to be shown with a gold background, flanking one another, hovering here. It uses the curve of the squinch to force an interaction with the figures, almost in a psychological cross-referencing manner. So they wrap the figures around Christ physically. The same, of course, was true for the Transfiguration we looked at on Mount Sinai. Down below in the earthly sphere, we move away from these scenes that are miraculous of figures floating and hovering to those grounded in death in the terrestrial realm where we are, where death occurs. Here we have the crucifixion appropriately located, as Christ is shown dead, flanked by the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist. Here below, in the Middle Byzantine period, we're going to find a mixture of the classical organic structure that was so appreciated in the Greco-Roman era with the linearity and abstraction so loved by the Byzantines. Hence, they're going to outline the figures, the musculature, the drapery with very clear contours or outlines. The painterly figures within these outlines are going to suggest three-dimensional bulk to them as they angle and foreshortened against the picture plane. However, the backdrop is going to be solid gold. We only know that we are at Golgotha because of the skull below, where blood and water pour separately out of the wounds of Christ onto, because Golgotha, where Christ is crucified, literally means the place of skulls. Now, if we think about the earlier Theotokos in Hagia Sophia, we can see the eclectic approach brought together here as we suggest the monumental forms of the bodies of the Virgin Mary dressed in blue, looking at her dead son on the cross, while St. John the Evangelist off to the right is gesturing out at us. These bulky forms are going to also be incised and in front of a flat background. Thus we have the competing two-dimensionality and three-dimensionality in Byzantine art. The non-narrative aspect of the scene is not new. Going back to the very first representation of the crucifixion, we have this devotional and intercessory role emphasized here, not as though we have Roman soldiers surrounding him and or we are about to take him off the cross. Christ will always be on the cross, always dying for the sins of Christians in this instance, and so we always are going to contemplate his death. The Christus Patiens scene here, or the suffering Christ, is going to be the type which becomes more common when the lands of Christianity are attacked by Muslims. So too do we find that Christ is going to be shown suffering in the same way, dead with his head slumping down to the lower right, because that's where the saved are in the Last Judgment. They will be in the left-hand side of the composition versus the damned in the right-hand side, as you see Christ judging above, looking towards the damned. Thus again, the terrestrial realm where we are equals death. The promise of salvation and resurrection is above us. In the celestial realm, the circular areas as they transition from the art shapes. Again, what do we have but something that is not exactly iconic? In this instance, we have a holy figure flanked by two other figures, which looks relatively common for this time, but we find that it is not going to have the figures both facing forward in a symmetrical fashion. Instead, they are very well modeled and take advantage of the eclecticism that is so common at this time. Along with mosaics, a cheaper alternative is very common throughout the Byzantine Empire, especially the Balkans, and that is fresco, the most popular being buon fresco, or painting on wet lime plaster. So this is going to allow a great deal of decoration to be carried out, which is relatively inexpensive. Here at St. Panteleimon at Nerezi, built between the mid-12th century, we find a more traditional kind of cloisonné technique, much like Hosios Lukas, in the cross and square plan, but decorated on the interior with a series of frescoes. Here we find one of the most famous images inside the church is the Lamentation from 1164. The Lamentation, it must be remembered, is extra-biblical. It is apocryphal, meaning that it's not part of the Bible, but is associated with the stories in between the others that are official. So, for instance, Christ died, he's taken off the cross. Then in the biblical interpretation, he's buried. In between that, you have the holy figures there present during the crucifixion lamenting his death, hence the lamentation. So here we see that Christ is spread out, laying in his mother's lap. She's still wearing the red shoes associated with the Byzantine emperor that we looked at before, while the other apostles and figures are going to be looking on, crying, lamenting him. So in this instance, we are encouraged to imitate the Virgin and St. John with the intense emotions that we see. Affetti, the affectations, are going to clearly show us how we should feel that Christ was crucified and died for our sins. This juxtaposes Christ's death with his birth, in which you have the infant lying across his lap and in death as an adult, whereby the Virgin presses, in this analogous fashion, her cheek against his. So this is not the Eloisa Virgin that we talked about, and not the Hodegetria. So we find that in this instance, she is pressing and is snuggling Christ in this way. A very heartfelt type of image that is not as common in the South, but will become dominant in the North in Russia. Another type of work we see here with the heavenly ladder can be seen evolving in the 12th century with a new subject in icons. Instead of just one figure, one holy figure that we're looking at, or one holy figure flanked by two others, we now have a multitude of figures. In this particular instance, we have the heavenly ladder, which is written by John Climax. In his book, with 30 rungs reflecting the 30 chapters in the book, we have these holy figures that are on their way up to Christ, who is at the top, the pinnacle of this ladder, waiting to welcome them if they can make it. Now, it is non-narrative in this instance, and we have only one holy figure traditionally. But the path to spiritual perfection is wrought with danger, as these black demons with the wings are going to pull the holy figures down. So here we have a more traditional icon, which has no narrative, no action, and with one figure. Now we're transitioning to multiple figures. Still a gold background, still it allows us to contemplate what we are doing here on earth and the way in which we can achieve salvation by giving us an example of moving one chapter to the next, one rung to the next, getting closer and closer to God. So we would find that monks would pray before embarking on a journey or on their spiritual quest. So they too must avoid the pitfalls of being dragged down to hell and locked in this tormented area, a massive mouth in the lower left-hand section eating the figures that are being pulled down, or those trapped in this ball of fire to the lower right. We find here John Climax, the author of the book, is the first to reach Christ. Behind him, labeled in Greek as well, we have the Archbishop Antonius, who could have been the person who paid for the work as the patron. Some of the monks are going to fall victim here again to the temptations of vice, and they are dragged down to hell. Here we can see the mouth that is opening up to consume them, this kind of gargantuan mouth that is going to eat us all and consume us into the bosom of hell itself. This is going to be common and reflect in the same time Last Judgment scenes that are more common in the West, with the figure of the mouth eating the damned and sinners. This innovation of moving beyond a single figure and restricting it to iconic representations will be adopted later in Italy as a vita icon, or as a portrait of a saint surrounded by his life story. Most famously, we have St. Nicholas here, but St. Francis also is one of the most famous vita icons. Turning to the Byzantine Empire, we see that it extends all the way to Eastern Europe and the Middle East, but will survive intact in the north, in Russia. Here we find that in Kiev, in the 10th century, Vladimir, the prince of the Kievan Rus, where Russia derives its name, converted to Christianity. He then marries the sister of Emperor Basil II, and thus brings Orthodox Christianity and Byzantine art and architecture to the north. Yaroslav, Vladimir's son, would build a new church in the capital city and decorate it. He also brought in artists and materials from Constantinople to decorate this cross and square design. And this will be quite common. Artisans will be sent all over the Mediterranean to work for both Christian and Muslim patrons. Here the cross and square design can be seen in the center, whereby we have a Pantocrator conforming to Byzantine conventions in the central dome, with Christ holding the book in his left hand while giving the blessing of benediction with his right. If we compare this to the earlier church in Daphne of Dormition, we can see the same similarities. Now Christ has a beard, the cruciform halo, the Greek identifications on either side of his head, surrounded by an oval mandorla or a rainbow. The Virgin is alone down below in an orange pose, or the praying pose from early Christianity, and this connects the viewer with Christ in the dome above through the incarnation. Thus, of course, here in the orange pose from the Rabula Gospels, we still see the Virgin Mary, who is the conduit to salvation. She gives us access to divinity as she is going to birth Christ. Turning to the evolution in icons, we have them decorating the interiors of these Greek Orthodox churches on a new structure. We know that the clergy will display these icons in a hierarchical fashion on tiers known as templons or iconostases. Those are going to be the screens that divide us in the nave from the apse in the high altar. They are low columnar screens that are going to be added in the late Middle Byzantine period, seen here in the lower section at Kiev. On these screens, especially in the northeast and in Russia, we have several icons that develop that will be on the screen that we will periodically kneel and kiss towards. Hence, we have proskinesis, kissing towards. Here we have the most famous icon in Russia, known as the Vladimir Virgin, for it's from Vladimir, Russia, where we have again a virgin and child, or a Theotokos and child. This particular icon was believed to have saved all of Russia from the Tatar invasions and from the Poles in the 17th century. Its miraculous power would have been communicated as it was on the front gate and or marched into battle. Thus, of course, the Russians would have God on their side. Here we find the Byzantine tradition continues with the long straight nose of the Virgin, the small mouth and golden rays on Christ's drapery. There is a flat silhouette against gold here. And this is the Virgin of Compassion, the Eloisa, as we just mentioned, with a lamentation, who is more tender and provides a more personal image and contemplation of Christ's future sacrifice and the love of his mother. So here we find that this is not the Hodegetria. She is not pointing. Instead, she presses her cheek next to his, just like we talked about with the lamentation. So this is an emotional image as opposed to an iconic one. So instead of being prescriptive and laying out who Christ is, it shows you how you should feel. Comparing it to other icons, we should note that we have a much more personal and direct engagement with the Mother of God as a mother, a maternal figure, and the Christ child that she is protecting, that she is coddling here. So therefore, we can access her as a mother who can intercede on our behalf with her Son, looking directly out at us here. And so now we have a direct engagement with the divine that is even more so than when icons began in the 6th century to be developed. Now in the Fourth Crusade, even though the Venetians had done quite well trading with the Byzantines, they lead an attack to sack Constantinople. A Byzantine historian noted that they bear the cross of Christ on their shoulders, but even the Saracens or Muslims are kinder. In sacking the city, they bring back the spoils from Constantinople and put it on their cathedral. Now the last period of Byzantine art, or the last golden age, is going to last from 1261 to 1453, or the 2 centuries after recapturing Constantinople from the Fourth Crusade, to the loss, finally, to the Ottoman Turks, and the end of the Byzantine Empire. It was Michael VIII Palaiologos who would recapture Constantinople in 1261, reconstituting only a fragment of the previous empire. Seen here, the Ottoman Turks are going to control the Asian side of the Golden Horn, and then the Byzantines recapture only a small portion of the northern side, squeezed in between the Kingdom of Bulgaria and that of Servia. In one of these late Byzantine churches and decorations, the Church of Christ in Cora, which is now a museum, we have a series of frescoes which are much cheaper than mosaics, showing us that the resources the Byzantines had were far fewer in this late period. In this Paracelsian or side burial chapel, we have a very appropriate subject shown. The subject is very common in Byzantine art, but not so much in the West. It is called an anastasis, or a harrowing of hell, in which Christ is going to trample the doors of Hades. Once doing so, he is going to take from the tombs all of those that died before he was crucified. Often this shows the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, being pulled from their tombs. Often showing John the Baptist, who was beheaded before Christ died by 6 months. We have the kings from the Old Testament, such as King David, a relative of Christ. King Solomon and other Old Testament prophets are often shown, as well as martyrs who died for the Christian faith before Christ could save them. In this eclectic approach, we have a spaceless atmosphere that does not suggest the weighty bulkiness of the figures. Instead, the drapery is now fluid and flat. There is no concern with systematic observation. The figures are shown from different angles and perspectives, recombined on this flat surface, where Christ appears, shimmering in white garb, surrounded by a white oval mandorla, interspersed with the starburst patterns or rosettes. Below him there are 2 doors along with broken locks, with the devil tied up that's going to be subdued by Christ. Here we find that this interest in high emotion and drama is retained, especially in fresco decorations, which allows for a freer technique than mosaics. And so we focus on these moments where someone is dying, or Christ is breaking down the doors of hell, or these climactic narrative scenes, whereby we do not focus on the naturalism, but instead the spiritual significance and the emotional significance. Now in 1453, Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks, and the churches, like the Hagia Sophia, were converted to mosques to benefit this new civilization on the rise in the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire, however, does not fall completely. Russia becomes its heir and adopts Orthodox Christianity and the model of the Byzantine Empire. For, as it is stated, because the old Rome has fallen, and because the second Rome is now in the hands of the godless Turks, thy kingdom, O pious Tsar, is the third Rome. Hence, they are stating that you have Western European Rome, then the Byzantine version of Rome, and now Russia is the third Rome. In this instance, we have a familiar scene from Genesis 18, which is an abbreviated hospitality of Abraham, whereby we eliminate Abraham and Sarah with the three messenger angels, in this case prefiguring the Holy Trinity. The elongated proportions and delicate heads are all in similar positions, leaning to one side. Thus we find that there are three in one, or foretelling that you'll have God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as one. The figures, again, with the elongated heads, the long straight noses, the almond-shaped eyes, are taken from the Byzantine precedent, and this will become the dominant style that will be carried on in Russia. Whereas the future of Byzantine art can be seen to be carried on in the north in Russia, it also finds a home in Italy itself. Aside from Venice and, once again, Ravenna, we also see it spreading to the south. Now, most Italo-Byzantine art is going to be created during the Middle Byzantine period, at the height of this revival of iconophiles and the spread of mosaics, as emperors will send mosaicists and artisans throughout the Mediterranean. And one of those areas is, of course, Italy. The Middle Byzantine period saw building of new churches, not just in the Byzantine Empire proper, but also on the Italian peninsula. Here we have highlighted three important cities for the Republic of Venice as it rises. You have Constantinople, to the south Alexandria in Egypt, at the time dominated by Muslims, and then you have Venice in the Adriatic Sea in the lagoon to the north. Venice had been a Byzantine dependency until 751, when Ravenna fell to the Lombards. Now we find that with the Byzantines out of the area and not dominant any longer, Venice becomes independent and will become ruled by doges, the Venetian term for a duke. At the time, Venice had no church of imperial distinction, such as the Apostles' Shrine in Rome of St. Peter. So in order to validate the power that Venice held, they needed a relic that was as prestigious as an apostle. It was in 829 that the Venetians decide to steal the body of Saint Mark in a holy theft from Alexandria, Egypt. They, of course, saw in a vision one of their priests that Saint Mark would want to lie under the stars of the Venetian lagoon. So they are going to transport his body in a barrel of pork to get him past Muslim customs. Then they build the first palace chapel and martyrium to him in 976. Doge Domenico Contarini is going to build the second shrine, which was begun in 1063, 2 decades into his rule as Duke. Here we have the finished version of the second shrine, that named St. Mark's for this apostle. The structure is actually modeled on the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, where we have a cruciform Greek cross plan, a central dome with 4 other domes over equal arms of this Greek cross, seen here. So we have extensive remodeling of this cathedral in the early 19th century in 1807, but there are a great deal of the original mosaics surviving going back to the 11th century. The facade of St. Mark's is a combination of Byzantine, Islamic, and Gothic styles, a very interesting, eclectic kind of mashup, which is, of course, going to be a metaphor for Venice itself as the gateway between East and West, between Latin and Greek traditions, between the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. The columns and decorations were actually plundered from the capital in Constantinople when Venetians led the attack in 1204 during the Fourth Crusade. Here they decorated their new cathedral with spoils from the sack of 1204. Thus we have many more columns than are needed for structural support. Instead, they show that they are the inheritor of the power of the Byzantine Empire. Above, you also have the quadriga, the four horses that are going to be dominant on the main church portal. Down below, we see the columns that were taken again from the sack. This is known as spolia, or the reuse of materials in a new context. So the multicolored columns of exotic marble and porphyry would immediately strike viewers in Venice as not Western, as not part of the tradition and other architectural features in the city in the lagoon. Instead, they are going to show the inheritor of this Byzantine power and tradition is going to be Venice. Here we can see the church that this is based on, the Apostolian in Constantinople. Thus we have the new Apostolian, the new Constantinople here is going to be established. The quadriga above the main doorway, or four-horse chariot, is actually taken from the Hippodrome, or chariot stadium in Constantinople. Now the four horses are in the museum inside. You have replicas outside, but these would be immediately identified as imperial in their connotations. Thus, Venice is claiming to be a new naval empire. Further proof of this new imperial designation for St. Mark's can be found off to the side in another spolia. Here they incorporate two columns that were broken apart of the tetrarchs from Constantinople and are integrated into the facade itself, purple being the color of imperial royalty, and here we have four Roman emperors. Thus, of course, the actual forms that we have from antiquity are going to be pasted on the front of the structure. Now here we have the extensive remodeling of the cathedral in Venice taking place in 1807. The original is modeled after the Church of the Holy Apostles, or Apostolian, in Constantinople, which was a cruciform Greek cross plan with a central dome with four other domes over equal arms of a Greek cross. Thus this is an example of Italo-Byzantine architecture. So the Greek cross and square plan with a dome is very common in Middle Byzantine churches. We saw it at Hosios Lukas, the churches of Dormition, and many others. The central dome with four other domes off to the side with equal arms is also going to be originally the design from Middle Byzantine churches, but in this instance is actually going to be reflective of other traditions. If we look at the domes, the kind of ovoid pattern that we have here are actually not Western, but instead are going to be these bulbous superstructures that are indicative of Islamic architecture. You can see here from this transverse section or cross section of the domes themselves that the actual hemispherical domes terminate much lower on the structure. These additional wooden domes that support above are going to be derived from their contact with Islamic architecture. The same date as St. Mark's, we see Santa Sofia in Kiev also has similar domes, these bulbous protrusions at the top. This is not Byzantine. This is not classical. Instead, it's derived from the influence of the East. So the outer shell lanterns are decorated with ribbed bulbous contours, and these come from Islamic types at the same time, especially in Egypt. So Howard is going to argue that these Egyptian prototypes and domes are actually taken from Egyptian mausoleums. Thus, we have this transcultural transference of meaning. In other words, the Muslims are going to use these types of bulbous domes to mark where someone important is buried. So therefore, we take the same meaning and bring it over in a Christian context to decorate a Christian burial place for a Christian martyr. Now, the dome of Hagia Sophia is quite big. It's 108 feet wide and 180 feet high. Obviously, the church at St. Mark's is meant to emulate the structure, but they're limited in the area that they can build because it's on a lagoon and the space that they have is quite limited. On the interior, the Venetian and Byzantine artisans attempted to replicate the decorations in St. Mark's. With 40,000 square feet of mosaics, the central dome is only 80 feet tall and 42 foot in diameter, but it has the same type of architectural features and decorations as Hagia Sophia, but in a new Italo-Byzantine style, which brings East and West together. Here we're following the Byzantine types with drapery coils and swirls and complex compositions and figural groupings, like the Lamentation at Nerezi that we looked at. Light will come through the windows at the bases of all the 5 domes, much like they do with the pendentive structure at Hagia Sophia, thus letting God into the interior, letting light reflect off of and refract off of the golden mosaics, giving it a spiritual essence and quality. The inscriptions, appropriately in Italo-Byzantine fashion, are both Latin and Greek, thus showing that Venice is the link between East and West. The episodes in the galleries off to the side showcase the life of Christ. We can see them here up above as we see the anastasis or harrowing of hell to the left and the crucifixion to the right. Down below we have other episodes such as Pontius Pilate washing his hands before the crucifixion and the passion. To the right lower section we have Christ on the way after his arrest to Golgotha. Here in the harrowing of hell or the anastasis, we have a similar scene to that looked at in the late Byzantine example with the Paracelsian, whereby Christ after his death knocks down the gates of Hades with all of its chains and keys, breaking them, pulling people out of their tombs that died before his crucifixion. The drapery, notably as the hard coiled lines and complex figural groupings that are quite common in Byzantine art, all with a gold background reflecting the light with the windows above. Here we find the transition from earth to heaven as in other Middle Byzantine churches, with these scenes of Christ ascending and or the Virgin Mary leading up to the 12 apostles and Pantocrators above. The central dome shows the ascension with the Virgin and prophets below, in between trees like in the 6th century mosaics and churches in Rome. There are also Western editions of virtues between the windows below, these allegorical personifications of Christian virtues. This is the Middle Byzantine program brought to the West, with these angels and Christ and the Virgin Mary seen here below the Pantocrator with Christ judging above. The virtues below include prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, faith, hope, and charity. These, of course, are going to be very common in representations in the West from this point onward, and are labeled intermittently with Latin and Greek text. Above, we have Christ ascended, floating within his oval mandorla, seated on the dome and canopy of the heavens, holding the scroll in his left hand while he raises the right in a blessing of benediction, looking to his right, thus looking towards the saved. And this, of course, is a very optimistic image of Christ Pantocrator, unlike those in areas where the Arab Muslims had been taking over territory from Orthodox communities. Here, the figures in the domes are going to be weightless as they float here. We don't have them set within realistic spaces. Instead, the goal is this spiritual truth that you see not with earthly eyes, but with spiritual ones. Again, just as with the Transfiguration, we have the curvature of the dome and the apses used to the benefit of the scenes, as figures will flank Christ. Angels will literally hover around him three-dimensionally, as he is going to be in a concave surface. Down below these mosaics in the high altar, we have the so-called palladoro, or golden altarpiece, named appropriately for the amount of gold on it and in it. This was designed originally in 1105 and further decorated in 1209, with much of the spoils brought back from the Fourth Crusade. It is later reassembled in the 14th century. It is the best surviving example of Byzantine enamel work that we have. Obviously, Venice was not conquered until it's going to surrender in the late 18th century to Napoleon, so it remains intact right above the body of St. Mark, the apostle for which this church is built. Now, the composition of the Polidoro is an iconostasis, or this type of screen used in other Middle Byzantine churches. It has numerous small scenes or miniature icons, quite literally, in a cloisonné enamel technique. Here we can see the iconostasis and the apparent commonalities between them as we compare what the Polidoro looks like to other screens in Byzantine churches. Now, the original version of the Polidoro was ordered from Constantinople from Doge Pietro Orsiello in 976. The new Palla, ordered from Constantinople by Doge Orfallo Falier in 1105, was meant to serve as an antependium, or as something to hang at the bottom of an altar. So altarpieces generally sit on top of an altar. The original one would have been an antependium, or an altar front, decorating the lower part of the altar. Here we have examples with the crucifixion on the Polidoro of this enameled technique. And like the decorative architectural applications, we have colored sections framed by darker metal. In this case, they're welded into place. Just as we would use a cloisonné technique to describe the brickwork in Middle Byzantine churches, here it's used to describe the framing of these enameled jewels and colors with gold and metal. We have powdered glass and gems that are melted here and poured into a pre-made and designed cavity. They are fused with gold or silver on the surface, and metal is welded in between these partitions to keep them in place. Between the stained glass and mosaic, we often find enriched with jewels and cameos. This is a very wealthy, a very expensive commission. Here we find that the cloisonné enameled technique is still used today with jewelry and other luxury crafts. Now, it was reworked in 1209 when the Fourth Crusade brought back the central plaque of the Pantocrator from the iconostasis in Constantinople, the very important screen that they had in the capital. Now, the designs seen in Italo-Byzantine art in Venice were not strictly restricted to the north. We find that in the south they are equally important, especially in Sicily. Sicily, importantly, is the largest island in the Mediterranean, and it was a Byzantine territory until the 8th century. Muslims are going to conquer it from the 9th to the 11th century, and then the Normans, or Northmen, the Vikings that settled in northern France, would occupy it in 1060 with troops led by Roger of Normandy. So the Norman Empire that existed after the Normans also conquered England, it consisted of the Empire of the Two Sicilies, which is southern Italy and Sicily, equal to the size of the previous Western Empire. The Norman kings sought to emulate Byzantine models and even planned to invade Constantinople in 1147. Here we have a mosaic demonstrating that of King Roger II of Sicily, this one in Palermo from 1148. Here we can see the commonalities with the previous Byzantine sumptuary arts, whereby Christ is crowning a secular figure, a ruler here on earth, thus giving him the power to rule and the power of Christ's authority. The Byzantine court costume seen here is going to complement the crown that is given to him by Christ, the Byzantine stemma. This is going to identify Christ with identical facial features. So notice that Christ and the king look the same hair, the same beard, the same eyes and nose. Thus, we have the earthly counterpart to Christ. Moving now to Palermo, Cefalù, and Monreale, we have important cities whereby the Italo-Byzantine decorations can be found under Norman rule. Here in Palermo, we have the Cappella Palatina, which was commissioned as a royal chapel, much like the Palatina Chapel in Aachen of Charlemagne we'll discuss here shortly. This one decorated between the mid-12th century. Here we have later mosaics in the apse that continue this Middle Byzantine program, whereby you see the lower section of the Virgin Mary flanked by Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist from the 19th century. Above, we have a wooden ceiling in the nave with Islamic hanging honeycombs. Therefore, we have Fatiman craftsmen also working for Christian patrons, just as Constantinopolitan or Byzantine artists are working for Muslim patrons. Here, this is much like the hanging decorative style, such as with the Palace of Lions in Spain. Above, we have the view into the dome with Christ Pantocrator surrounded by angels. The form of Christ with his bent fingers, holding in his left hand the book, looking off to the left, are all taken from the Byzantine prototype in the Church of the Dormition. Now, the Pantocrator in the west is spelt with a C, whereas in the Greek East it's spelt with a K. Here we have angels and archangels, evangelists and the squinches, and prophets on the walls between, all taken from the decoration of this other Middle Byzantine church. But we can especially see that this is taken specifically from the Church of the Dormition, because Christ looks off to his left towards the damned. His fingers are going to be curled down instead of blessing upward, and he holds the same bejeweled book. The decorations below in the tripartite division between heaven and earth are also going to be from Byzantine precedents. However, they are much more discursive. The nativity scene, for instance, comes from Matthew 2, which is the only gospel which mentions the Magi coming to find Christ after his birth. The Middle Byzantine style can be seen here with the hard outlines and the complex groupings. But again, it is more discursive than at Daphne. That being, it adds more narrative details with the elements of the Magi seen twice. First in the upper left-hand corner, and then again finding Christ in the lower right-hand corner. It also exaggerates the hierarchy of scale, with the Virgin Mary being by far the largest figure in the scene. We find that it also breaks in the architectural pockets and spills out onto other walls. So we continue the scene of the Nativity off onto the right wall, with inscriptions just as in St. Mark's in both Latin and Greek. Here, with the entry into Jerusalem, we also see a much more discursive approach to the Byzantine style, with Christ riding in on Palm Sunday with the palm leaves laid before him, people taking off their cloaks in the lower section to put under his donkey. The two Adventist scenes, that being the revealing of Christ as king, are going to allude to the royal reception in foreign lands of these Norman kings who come from the north and then are received as kings just as Christ was in Jerusalem when they arrived in Sicily and in the southern boot of Italy. The last church we'll look at is the cathedral at Cefalù, founded in 1131. Roger II founded this as a royal burial church for the Norman kings. It is an Italian Romanesque basilica with a wooden roof and transepts. Only in Italy did they continue to build with wood in the Romanesque period. Stone was more common elsewhere in Europe. Here, there is no dome, because domes are not common in Romanesque architecture. Instead, the Byzantine artists had to modify the program to the apse, showing Christ Pantocrator in the uppermost section of the apse, with the Virgin Mary flanked by angels below, just as she would be in a Pantocrator scene in other Middle Byzantine churches, and then the apostles below that, 6 on each side of the window. The abridgment of these mosaic schemes are going to be quite common and included all the same motifs. So we can still see Christ Pantocrator, we still see the Virgin Mary and angels, we still see the apostles. The massive super icon, as it's called, is going to hold a book that is written in both Latin and Greek. Greek on the left-hand side of the page, Latin on the right, and is actually taken from John 8:12, stating, "I am the light of the world." Here we have the same adjustments that are going to be made also in the cathedral and monastery of Monreale, but we have now a dynamic style. Here, if we compare the Pantocrators from Cefalù and Monreale, we can see a much more spread out version of Christ's arms that almost hugs the viewer on either side of the apse. Here we can see the image of Christ taken again from the Middle Byzantine Pantocrator at Daphne in the Church of the Dormition, as Christ's fingers angle down and he looks off to the left with the bearded face here and his comportment, whereby we also activate now all parts of the apse with the outstretched arms. The Byzantine heritage, in essence, continues after the fall in 1453 in both the West, that being in Italy, and in the East in Russia.